Hello, welcome to Arsha Wireless News. I'm Roberta, Prescott, Latin America correspondent. With the Olympic and Paralympic Games starting next August 5, Arsha Wireless is posting several serious stories about how mobile networks, information technology are being deployed to support the games. I'm sorry, I don't have camera. I have a computer problem with my computer on upgrading to Windows 10. So I welcome Brendan Gill, co-founder of OpenSignal. They just released a survey on 4G and LTE stage of mobile networks. Hi, Brendan. Nice to have you at Arsha Wireless News.
Hi, Roberta. Thanks for having me.
Great. So let's start. I would like you to start comparing this year's survey with August survey.
Yeah, so we just released today our latest State of Mobile Networks Brazil report, where we look at the performance of all the operators in Brazil across a whole manner of different metrics, where we look at everything from speed that's being provided on both 3G and 4G networks, all the way to availability, which is a measure of how frequently users can get signal and be connected to the network. So since we published the first report in August last year in Brazil, and a year has now passed since then, so we've seen a lot of changes in the market. For one, 4G is clearly being rolled out, and over time we're seeing an increase in the 4G availability, which is great news for people in Brazil, as 4G brings faster speeds, greater reliability, and is an overall better experience for users. And in this year we've seen a lot of changes when it comes to the speed being provided on 4G. And we've seen the actual fastest network in Brazil change and evolve over that time. Going from last year in August, we were recording the fastest speeds on the Claro 4G network. But now in the latest report, we're seeing Vivo is now providing the fastest speeds in 4G. So there's been some changes there as well.
Great. And can you give me a heads up about how do you measure these networks? Which is OpenSignal install base using applications that can measure all the speed and availability of LTE connections?
Yeah, absolutely. So the way we measure mobile networks is kind of different to the older ways of doing it. We measure directly in the real world from user devices. We see exactly what users see, where they see it, and using the devices that they use, all done through our mobile application, which is free to download for consumers. So we've got millions of users who have downloaded this app around the world. In Brazil, the most recent report was based on a sample of about 45,000 users all over Brazil, who collect billions of data points on the network performance that they're receiving. And we take all this data centrally, analyze it, process it, and then we output this report, providing all the different metrics that we look at in Brazil. So the way we think of our methodology is that it's a way of not simulating what people experience as some traditional methods used to do, but really just measuring from the real world, what are consumers experiencing on a day-to-day basis in the locations that they're using their mobile devices. So it's a very real-world picture of the mobile performance that people are experiencing in Brazil.
I see. And another point that caught my attention is that the survey points out that 4G availability improved, but Brazil still ranks near to the bottom of the table of 4G amongst its Latin America and global peers. So what do you think is that happening right now? Do you think maybe it's because where do you have big cities, mobile carriers are concentrated their coverage on this, and it lacks to coverage the rest of Brazil? So what's happened to put Brazil in the bottom of the table of 4G availability?
Yeah, I mean, Brazil is a very unique country. You know, it's this very big country, both in population and geographical area. When you put it in the context of Latin America, there's always going to be different dynamics in Brazil. And at this point in the rollout of 4G, it's still relatively early days. It's not yet a technology that's everywhere. There are still many places to be rolled out to. And even in the locations where it's being rolled out, it's still not completely ubiquitous. And we're seeing the availability of between around 50% across Brazil. But in places like Rio, we're seeing greater 4G availability in the 65 to 75% range approximately. So even in places like Rio, it's not a ubiquitous technology. So we need a bit of time for the rollout to happen before we know exactly what the situation is going to be, and you know, putting it in the comparison with other countries. So to some extent, it's still early days, and it's a very unique geography. So Brazil has a much larger area to cover. That's always going to be a challenge. But we are seeing, when you look at a dense location like Rio, we are seeing much increased 4G availability. So at the very top of the rankings for 4G availability in Rio, we were seeing that, I'm just trying to check the results live so that I can give them to you. In Rio, we were saying Vivo and Nextel had 73 and 78% 4G availability. So that's getting towards the higher part of the spectrum where users can expect a 4G signal most of the time. So when you look at particular cities like Rio, more denser urban areas, we are seeing much more 4G availability. So you just need to understand the metrics in their context. And when you look at Brazil as a whole country, that maybe misses some of the nuances of coverage in cities like Rio and Sao Paulo.
And based on the results, what do you think are the major challenges and problems to fix? Speed could be one of them, and coverage the other, and to reach rural areas, for example, as you were saying, the size of Brazil. But comparing to other big countries, what do you think are the major challenges carriers need to address right now?
Yeah, I think in Brazil it's very much the fact that we're still in the rollout phase. Yeah, that's the biggest thing that the operators in Brazil need to do, is to continue to roll out 4G technologies in wider areas, and then potentially getting into recycling some of the older technologies and turning them off and transitioning them to 4G. Because when you have a 4G connection, you do see very, very decent speeds. Anything above 10 megabits per second is going to give you a good experience. And the bigger challenge is that users are only getting 4G availability, you know, between 55 and 65% of the time. So it's not something that they can rely on always getting. And that's the biggest thing the Brazilian operators can do, is just provide this 4G service as much as possible. And what they need to look out for is that as they do this, that the quality doesn't suffer. And that is a trend we observe around the world, that sometimes by rolling out 4G too aggressively, the network can get spread too thin and the speeds can come down and they can suffer. So the challenge for the operators is really to continue this rollout and do it whilst not reducing the quality of service that consumers are currently getting when they can get a 4G connection in Brazil.
And what are the survey conclusions regarding the stage of mobile networks for Rio Olympic and Paralympic Games? I talked with all major carriers and basically infrastructure providers for conducting my several stories for OurShare, and they said they have prepared their networks and they are putting mobile cells, those that are not fixed, so they can move it where it's more crowded, and they have improved the coverage with the small cells. But I can tell from my own experience attending game at World Cup that it might not happen at all. At the World Cup, I was attended a game in São Paulo. I was 3G customer from two major carriers, and I couldn't take photo, talk on WhatsApp, or access Facebook, Twitter, or any other social media. And I pretty much guess that people that are going to Rio are going to be willing to take pictures in high definition and send these through social medias or apps such as WhatsApp. What are you feeling about that?
Yeah, well, we've tried to examine what the current data suggests about the performance in the Olympics. The big difference in the Olympics with the World Cup 2 years ago is the rollout of 4G technology. And ultimately, it's very hard to predict what's going to happen. You know, having hundreds of thousands of people, maybe millions of people come onto the network in very specific locations is a challenge for operators to cope with and deal with. And it's very hard to know in advance what's going to happen until it actually happens. You know, you can make a lot of simulations, but until it happens, it's very hard to predict exactly how well they will stack up. But this big change in having 4G is a very positive improvement. 4G networks are better at dealing with capacity. They're more efficient as well. It's not only providing faster speeds to users, but it's the network technology is more efficient and it can cope with greater demand as well. The flip side to that is that sometimes with better connections, the natural consumer behavior is to use them even more. And so there may be increased demand from 2 years ago. Now that more people have smartphones, more people are used to using data and are going to be sending more and more pictures. So the 4G technology should help. It's a bit of a concern that it's still not ubiquitous. If you could rely on 4G a greater proportion of the time, I think that would help operators a bit more. But just for the proportion of time that users do see 4G, that should help the operators. But we'll be looking closely. We know that the operators have all done a lot of planning, and indeed the key to them will be getting users in the very dense areas, in the stadiums, right at the peak events, right at the moments when the events are happening, when there's winners and losers and everyone's sending pictures. At those moments, having a lot of local capacity, mobile cells, small cells, Wi-Fi, and getting as much of that onto these local networks, because the macro networks will always have difficulty when a huge number of new people are trying to use them. So if they plan that in the right way, then despite not having 4G ubiquitous across the country, the right localized planning could go a long way.
Yeah, I believe it. So just for curiosity, did you had any evaluation on London 2012?
No, that's not a particular analysis we've done. We were in 2012, we were still relatively early in our growth and weren't yet publishing reports. So we don't have any specific analysis on London 2012.
Okay, because then by then we were seeing 4G networks increasing and high definition cameras on cell phones. So I think the challenge this year will be to measure the capacity or to size this traffic demand capacity for all these thousands of people that are going to be watching the games.
Yeah, I think these days, you have to get very smart about the traffic management, and indeed operators and the infrastructure and tools that they use are getting more intelligent. Because ideally, you're always going to have a lot of data being sent, and there will be peak moments where it's difficult to cope with the demand. But you don't want to turn people off the basic data services. Ideally, messaging services that don't use a lot of bandwidth would still work in those circumstances so that people can get around. And maybe it's just the pictures and social media that can suffer in the short term. So a lot of that technology is really advanced, and operators have greater experience now dealing with larger capacity events. And indeed, in Brazil, the operators have had one of the largest events 2 years ago as a dry run for the Olympics. So there should be a lot of learnings that they can take from that. That should put them in a better place. But it will be interesting to see what happens once everyone descends on Rio.
Yeah, I can tell you, I'll be attending almost 10 competition on Rio Olympics, and I will be checking mobile carriers network. So I'd like to thank you a lot for joining our show, Wireless News. I'm really sorry I couldn't turn on my camera, but I think it just went pretty good.
It was great to be here. Thanks for having me, and hopefully we can do it again with camera next time.
Yeah, sure. Well, for those who are watching, our show Wireless News is posting several story series about the mobile networks on Rio 2016, and also the new technology they are using in the games. So check out all of that at ourshowwireless.com.